program.
It's great to be here again, Michael.
Talking about leadership as we were and as we are, as you look around the world and around this country, what do you make of the current, I guess we could call it the COVID leadership?
It's quite varied, isn't it? There was a piece you probably saw that pointed out that the 5 countries that are maybe dealing with this best, they're all led by women. Maybe ego is a big problem in so-called leadership. I'm also, I'm a bigger fan of management than leadership. Leadership's important, but leadership points to an individual, and I think the places that are doing well don't have this cult of individuality or heroic sort of lofty leadership. They have teamwork and a lot of cooperation that's going on across sectors and across people. So women may be much better at engaging or helping to engage or setting up the conditions to engage all kinds of people who don't lead individually, they lead collectively.
There is no way, let me make it derogatory. Was there any way for any political leader to prepare him or herself for what has come with the pandemic?
It's an interesting question because we have a graduate of our healthcare master's program who ended up running Doctors Without Borders for 2 terms internationally. And she came home, her second term finished. And this is public because there's been a kind of battle in the press about this. But the province was not enlisting her. If you want to talk about preparation for dealing with this, being the president of Doctors Without Borders is a heck of a lot better than being the president of the United States or the premier of Quebec. And yet they were hesitant to engage her. She's the one who knows how to deal with this kind of crisis. The short answer to your question is, how in the world do you prepare yourself for dealing with this? You don't if it never happened before, but you find people to whom it happened before, like Joanne was deeply involved in the Ebola crisis, very personally involved in the Ebola crisis.
When we talked about, you talked about rebalancing society, you made a number of suggestions. Actually, some of them were almost predictions in a way on how to restore the balance in society. Given what we have seen and will see in COVID-19 and its aftermath, how are your suggestions and your ideas panning out?
Well, that's an unfair question because I'm biased. So, I'm going to see what I believe.
You stated your bias. Your bias is out in front, so that's fine.
Okay, good. My view, what I think you're referring to is balance across 3 sectors of society: government, business, and community, what I call public, private, and plural sectors. I think what's come out here, and I've sort of restated it accordingly, is that governments essentially protect us. Businesses essentially supply us, and communities essentially engage us. I suspect that the countries that are doing best, or the provinces or whatever that are doing best, are managing to do that. Government recognizes its role in protection, which Trump does not. Didn't take long to bring him in, and businesses supply, whether it's physical equipment or gloves or masks, and communities engage, and things work best where people. These Zoom calls are largely community calls. They're people sort of engaging together in how we deal with this. And the countries that are doing worst, and not coincidentally, the UK and the US, the 2 great liberal democracies of the world, and neither of which recognizes that liberal democracy has become illiberal and undemocratic, are doing among the worst, and probably the worst, certainly the US by far, because they are utterly out of balance on the side of private sector forces.
Let's look at the healthcare system, because you and I spent a lot of time talking about it a couple of years ago, about how splintered and fragmented the healthcare sector was in Canada. Last week on the program, we looked at the disaster in long-term care. What do you think the pandemic has revealed about what's working and what isn't in the way our healthcare system is structured?
Oh, interesting. I've been on constant calls not constant, but at one point daily 2-hour calls, and now a little less frequently, with a few ER people, emergency room people in Quebec City, who are in our healthcare program, and these guys are right in the middle of it, and boy, I can't find any fault with what people are doing on the ground. They're struggling like mad. They're amazing. We have huge debt to pay to these people. Thank you, and it's also revealed governments, some of which are smart and have thought it through. Korea seems to be an exemplary case. Maybe New Zealand. And governments that have been just terribly, terribly awful, and deniers and all kinds of things. And it's usually the bunch of bullies like Bolsonaro in Brazil and Trump and Johnson and so on, who just dumb, just plain dumb.
I remember there was a phrase you used. You said that medicine, public medicine, should be a calling and not a business. How has the pandemic either supported that view or gone against it?
Well, it's supported it and also flagged those people. Anybody who's trying to rip off now, any companies that are trying to rip off now are just getting it in their neck. Because people are so angry, or they're trying to sort of exploit, some inventory of masks or whatever, as compared with the people who are banging the pots in grateful thank you to the healthcare providers. Boy, talk about a calling. What could be more of a calling than putting your life on the line every day you walk into an ER or an ICU?
When we were talking about the balanced society, and you mentioned the three legs, the three foundations, the public sector, the private sector, and the plural sector, as you called it, how are these three legs balanced in our society before the pandemic? And how are they holding up during it?
I think that may be the same question. The ones that had it together before are dealing with it during, because they didn't have to sort of suddenly come to their senses. They were in their senses before. To me, the most balanced societies on earth are probably several of the Scandinavian countries. New Zealand, Canada, less so, but still quite balanced. Quebec more than the rest of Canada, a little bit, in the sense that there's a greater sense of community in Quebec. And unfortunately, when the Premier tries to run it, as coming back to your idea of leadership, when they try and run it through the center, instead of letting the communities in and community action, they run into trouble. So I think you can go around the world and see the countries that were balanced. Germany, look at Germany's result, not on cases, but on deaths. Japanese result is exemplary. Germany not only still has Merkel in power, but Germany's very balanced. The sense of community is very, very strong. In Japan, the sense of community is kind of built into government and business. And so it was naturally strong, naturally balanced in a way. And as I said before, the UK and the US are among the worst balanced country. Russia, because it's all built around one guy. Talk about leadership. Same thing with Brazil, which was a very balanced country before Bolsonaro did his number on the country. Very, very balanced place before. By the way, that would be an example where, what they were before is not what they are now. But that's simply because Bolsonaro appeared on the scene in between.
All right, but when you look to our neighbor, to the Great Republic to the south, and think about balance, what goes through your head? How do you integrate the U.S. in all this?
Well, first of all, business has always been the major player in the U.S. I mean, Jefferson complained in 1816 in a letter about how business is already trying to take over the republic. I mean, that's literally what he said in 1816. Business has always been a major force, and government has always been marginalized because of that. In fact, the checks and balances that the Constitution talked about are checks and balances on government, which empowered business. So there's always been that leaning. But government was still quite powerful and important. You know, if you go back to the 70s when things were saner, the U.S. had high tax rates, they had very generous welfare programs, and so on. And then, and then it all changed. Sense of community, the Americans are the greatest organizers on earth. They organize at the drop of a hat. They'll organize everything. The Flying Funeral Directors of America is my favorite example of this. So community's always been strong, but it's taken a terrible hit, as most countries have in a way, because a lot of the technologies have weakened community, and the mobility of the United States weakens community, and so on. So, the hope for America getting back to balance rests in its communities. They're just such wonderful organizers. If you read de Tocqueville, publishing in the 1830s about the new democracy in America, he was talking extensively about the role of community, what he called associations, the role of community organizations, not private sector businesses, not public sector governments, but all of those other organizations, the NGO, in those days, political parties and local community groups and so on. He described that as a key to the new American democracy. That's what has to be restored in the United States.
Has there been a rebalance, in your view, toward the public and government sector and private sector since the pandemic hit?
I'm not sure I'd call it a rebalance, but a swing. Governments, as you see with Trump's behavior, governments just can't stay out of it. They've got to do a lot more. So Trump, despite all of his, ridiculous statements, had to acquiesce on all kinds of issues about forcing businesses to produce certain products. Or whatever it is. So there was no choice. Whether that's balance, it's almost like a standoff in the United States. Relationships between the sectors have become so strained that it's not a balance. Because a balanced society not only has three balanced sectors, those sectors work cooperatively. Look at Denmark. I did a blog, my blog is minster.org/blog. I did a blog on Denmark called Nothing's Rotten in the State of Denmark. I visited it, and the way they work together, the way the sectors work together, the way the people, you know what entrepreneurs say in Denmark and other Scandinavian countries? They say, we can be an entrepreneur much more easily. A woman who tried to do in both the US and Denmark, it's much easier to be an entrepreneur in Denmark than in the United States. Why? Because with the welfare programs in Denmark. So if I try and be an entrepreneur and I fail, I know my kids will still go to school for free.
Right.
I know they'll still have health care.
But the failure of that in the current political climate in the U.S., one wonders how it can be healed, how it can be brought together again after, in the post-COVID era.
Well, you can only hope that the shock to the system will wake enough people up. Americans do wake up sometimes, and you can only hope that it'll wake people up, because if the U.S. keeps going where it's going now, the consequences will be dire.
My guest this morning is Henry Mintzberg. He's been on our program many, many times over the years. He's the Gleichhorn Professor of Management Studies at McGill University. This morning, he is in Laurentians in Quebec. Henry, you've said that corporations are social institutions, but they don't serve society. If they don't, they have no business existing. How are corporations in the private sector doing during the pandemic?
Well, it's hard to say because they're all in such a different state. Who knows what they're really doing? I look at the ads. That's the only thing I'm getting exposed to, right? But the ads don't tell me what they're really doing. I read stories about some of them, like GM producing different kinds of products, and I have reason to believe them, and I applaud them for doing that, but I really can't. I read occasional story about some bank or some insurance company. I think you probably saw that car insurance that gives people a 10% discount on top of a 20% raise when they're using their cars less. So I think it varies. I think corporations have always had mixed results on this, and I think that now they would be much, much more careful not to play the games that so many of them, the phone companies in this country and the and the banks in this country too often play.
There's a story in the current New Yorker about a factory in Japan that burned to the ground. The factory made something to do with brakes, valves for brakes. And Toyota was the largest customer, and losing the factory was extraordinary for Toyota. And within 8 or 9 days, other companies had stepped in and were making the valves for Toyota. Why don't North American companies have that kind of resilience? We're still farting around about making masks and ventilators and that kind of thing. We don't seem to be flexible enough.
You know my answer to that. Of course, it's a much more balanced society. It's a much more sort of open, engaging society in a way. You know, when I visit Japan, I love visiting Japan because they so much have their act together. You know, you can just go anywhere and do anything, and the country works. They talk about 10 and 20 lost years, and I say to my Japanese friends, "Where are these lost years? Life seems great. People are functioning, everything's going well." So, and then the other thing they have, which was clear when we used to talk about the brilliance of Japanese management, I think it still maintains itself, is a very grounded kind of response. It's not all about chief executives. It's not all about leaders, lofty leaders and all this stuff. They don't go crazy for that stuff. It's about people on the ground. And the wonderful stories about Japanese companies are people on the ground who just come up with wonderfully interesting ideas. And when they're engaged, boy, you're all set. And that had to happen. I don't know the story, but 8 days, that had to happen with a lot of people on the ground, really deeply concerned about it.
I want to look at this, you coined the term, the plural society. That's between the private and public sectors. How important is that sector now, given the contagion and the way where the economy has cratered?
I wouldn't say between. I would say that it's a three-legged stool, if you